네, 안녕하세요. 오늘 컴업 2023 마지막 날 퓨처 토크의 진행을 맡은 주한 미국 상공회의소의 문수연입니다. 안녕하세요. 네, 오늘의 퓨처 토크도 아주 매운맛으로 준비를 해봤습니다. 요즘은 국내 창업에도 글로벌 진출이 필수 역량 중에 하나로 많은 분들이 생각을 하고 계시죠. 저도 지금 글로벌 기관에서 일을 하고 있다 보니까 좀 창업자분들과 얘기를 나누다 보면 여전히 외국 경험이 없는 분들에게 글로벌 시장은 다양한 오해 그리고 또 기회가 함께 공존하는 곳입니다. 현재 실제 여러 국가를 아우르며 사업 진행과 창업 지원 그리고 투자를 진행 중인 모더레이터 그리고 패널 분들을 모시고 글로벌 진출 그 오해와 진실에 대해 이야기해 보겠습니다. 모더레이터인 스타트업 정키의 Executive Consultant 매튜 워드 그리고 패널로 함께해 주실 MyFirstTech Co-founder 브라이언 텐, HKTDC의 디렉터 크리스토퍼 라이를 소개합니다. 이번 세션은 영어로 진행되니까요. 한국어 통역이 필요하신 분들은 뒤편 리시버 준비하셔서 채널 3번에 맞춰주시면 되겠습니다. 큰 박수로 환영해 주세요. Please welcome them with a warm round of applause.
Hello, can you hear me? All right. Hey everyone, and 안녕하세요. Great to see all of you here, especially on the third day at 10 a.m. Before we get into it, first, let's give a round of applause for the COMEUP organizers. This has been such a great event, and it's been amazing, so let's give them a round of applause. So my name is Matthew Ward, and I am a senior executive consultant at Startup Junkie, where we help startups get POCs with enterprises, and then we potentially invest in the startups based on that relationship. We run accelerators, run funds. We are backed by the Walmart Family Foundation and also the Small Business Administration as well. So, what are we talking about today? The myths and realities of going global. As a lot of you know, there is a lot of opportunity going global. For example, we worked with a client 20 years ago. We worked with a client who 20 years ago started out in their garage. And now they are a billion-dollar brand with over 200 locations and over 1,000 commitments with those as well. So it's awesome to have the opportunities, but what comes with that as well is challenges and hurdles. And that's why we have these awesome panelists who have been there, done that, and they'll tell you more about the insights and the experiences they've gone through with going global. So first, I'll introduce to you Brian Tan, who's on my left here. He is a co-founder of MyFirst. MyFirst is the world's first kids tech social ecosystem. Anything grown-ups can do with technology, kids can do the same safely. And currently, their Korean users are the most active amongst their users from 36 countries. And really fun fact quickly about Brian, he comes to Korean very often, enough to get haircuts here from Juno, and only Juno. He lives in Singapore, so very impressive. So let's give a round of applause to Brian. And next, I have the honor of introducing Chris Lay, who leads the Korea office of the Hong Kong Trade Development Council. They are not part of the Hong Kong government, but are a public sector nonprofit organization that aims to curate and facilitate cross-border business relationships across all sectors, regions, and partnership formats. So think imports, exports, business relationships, services, technology, etc. And really fun fact about Chris is he lived in Perth, Australia for over 12 years, which is deemed as the most isolated big city in the world, but he argues against that. There's up for debate. And that was 12 years pre-smartphones and pre-social media. So glad to have you straight here from the Bobby, and glad to have this discussion with both of you. So to kick it off, could both of you tell the audience more in detail about what each of you do specifically at your organizations? Whoever wants to take it, doesn't matter who.
Yeah, I'll go. Just a clarification, we sell in 36 countries, but we've got users from 100 countries because we're solving a global problem, right? So I'm at MyFirst, I take care of strategy, fundraising, and public relations. So basically, I just think and talk.
That's fair. Chris, what about you?
Well, I think for the Korean audience, it would be easy if I say this. Our organization, when it first started, was very similar to Kotra. But because Hong Kong's economy has changed, we have very little manufacturing now. So we focus on helping companies look for cross-border partners. And from a startup context, that could be anyone. It could be an incubator, accelerator, could be a customer, could be an investor. And just to add that, for Korean startups, for example, we see Hong Kong as a platform rather than a destination. So we would help them to connect with those potential partners from anywhere else.
Awesome. Thank you for the insight. So Brian, first for you, like you were saying, you have users in over 100 countries currently. Could you tell us more about the story of the early days of MyFirst and when you knew the timing was right to go international?
So we are really quite interesting in the sense that most governments will always ask their home companies to go global and they'll try to encourage them. But we were the opposite. So when we first started MyFirst, instead of selling in Singapore, we first started selling in Europe and Japan. And I mean, Singapore is a good market, but it's a really small market, right? So every year there are 30,000 kids born. Like even South Korea with its terrible birth rate, that's 250,000 kids, right? That's 8 times larger than Singapore, all right? Even Japan, terrible birth rate as well, 790,000, right? That's 25 times Singapore. And so we started in overseas markets first because we just knew that if you want to do something big, you can't just stay in Singapore. So from the get-go, it was only when investors came to us and said, how come I can't find your stuff in the stores in Singapore? That's when we started selling in Singapore, right? But other than that, we always had this global first approach.
And just to follow up on that, what advice would you give to founders who are trying to figure out where they need to go first? And you're talking about size of market. Would you recommend they do an analysis, stay with the home base first, which is not what you did, but what's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so you have to pick and choose carefully, right? Because as a startup, you're always dealing with limited resources, right? So we sell in 36 countries now. And if, let's say, we visit just one country a year, that's 3 countries a month. So we have to split, right? We all spend so much time on the road that we can be counted as non-Singapore tax residents, right? We're in so many countries all the time. So you have to pick and choose your battles, right? And that requires analysis and also working with local partners, right? Where it makes it just that much easier to come into a new market. So that's super helpful.
Yeah. Thanks for that awesome insight. And Chris, in your line of work, you have facilitated hundreds of meetings for Korean businesses and startups with potential partners, customers, and investors from around the world. What is your take on the right timing for startups to expand internationally?
I think there's 2 layers to that. I think firstly, in the lifespan of a startup, in general, of course, I think perhaps maybe past POC or once you've achieved POC, you can start looking to that. But I think the caveat, and I think Brian alluded to it as well, it really depends on, what line of business you're in, what sector you're in. For example, if you are a consumer, then, you can very well stay here for a little bit longer. But if you are involved in, say, airlines or shipbuilding, there's not that many companies in each country, so you need to look beyond the border. The other thing is, if we look from a global sort of macroeconomic, the current situation, because of, Brian alluded to the demographic issue in Korea, there's of course a lot of geopolitical issues and economic problems. This is a good time for startups to really look into going overseas, because if you too focus on the local economy, you may get left behind.
That's great. And follow up, Chris, could you share some insights on how startups can establish these partnerships and collaborations? And on top of that, how do these alliances impact the global expansion process?
Sure. I think if for example, if you're looking to go overseas, I think firstly, the usual things, you've got to study the market, you've got to study for the sector you're in, which areas are particularly important, or where are the growth regions in the world. And I think it's very important to remember that, for the entire lifespan of a startup, nothing is actually linear. Even within each touch point, it's not linear. Just for example, you may be, going to Hong Kong or in Singapore, another market, to look for investors, but the investor may not be, immediately interested in investing in you. They may want you to work with one of their portfolio companies first to ascertain, whether your product or your solution works for their market. So I think you need to keep an open mind. I also think it's very important that you sort of customize the way you approach investors to those particular regions. Just a quick example here. The Korean startup ecosystem is very well supported by the government, but that creates a sort of a scenario where a lot of startups don't have the experience of working with international investors. So when they talk to them, when they pitch to them, they may focus too much on the technology side rather than, say, the market or the business growth model or how the investor's going to make money. So I think they have to pay more attention in terms of how to talk to the investors or partners. Of course, if you're going there to look to grow your business, again, don't just straight away think I need to find a customer. Sometimes you may need to work with, say, agencies or the local governments who can help connect you. Maybe you need to fine-tune your product. Don't fall into the trap to think that your product is the final version. You need to customize your solution all the time.
I 100% agree with the agility and being able to take in the data and make sure you're optimizing that. Because as Brian said, you have limited resources as a startups. You gotta make sure you're being effective. So for both of you or one of you, a major theme we've heard throughout this event is collaboration. So do either of you have any stories or outcomes to share from either operating a business or helping out a startup to establish or grow a partnership internationally?
I'll chime in. All right. So we sell through distributors in every country that we go to. So as a foreigner coming to a lot of countries, it's very difficult to truly understand a new country, right? So if a foreigner tells you, I understand this country, either that person is delusional or they're getting cheated, right? Because it's not physically possible, right? It'll take years before you can truly understand. So it's really important to have somebody on the ground, somebody who knows the culture, and that can save you a lot of headaches.
Chris, any thoughts around that?
Sure. I think maybe I'll share two experiences. I can't name names because these are still ongoing partnerships, but there was a Hong Kong startup in sort of healthcare/platform. They came over, joined an accelerator program, couldn't really find any partnerships or find any customers. So we introduced them to a bank, one of the biggest banks here, and actually told them, this is not a potential customer yet. You need to really work with them, try to fine-tune your solution. And I think they on and off went through like a 9-month discussion and finally it actually in the end of the final product, at least right now, is quite different from what they bring over from Hong Kong. But now they're actually starting to test out the solution for the bank. So that's one. The other one is there's a logistics technology company from Korea. We introduced them to some of the government agencies and port operators, even when you the ship docks, there's a little boat, I can't remember the name of the boat, but there's a boat that guides them to the ports. We actually introduced them to those operators rather than the actual shippers because they need to test out whether the technology can work with those operators before they can go to the final customer. So it just goes to show, I think Brian mentioned as well, that you need to think about how to work with the overseas market, the overseas customers, rather than just go straight on.
That's great. So for anybody you're meeting with who's doing a startup and is looking to expand globally, as an advisor, what advice would you give for some underestimated challenges that they may face along the way to make sure they can mitigate that when they're expanding to other countries? Any thoughts around that, either of you?
Yeah, for us, we always get tripped up by administrative intricacies, right? So when we first came to Korea, I needed to get a work visa to set up a company here. In order to get a work visa, I needed a Korean bank account. But I'm a Singapore passport holder, and Singapore passport has alphabets in our passport, and the Korean banking system doesn't like that, right? So I couldn't get a bank account. So they told me in order to get a bank account, I needed a Korean work visa. So this is an infinite loop, right? And we were here with an accelerator, but they helped manage to break that loop. And so we managed to overcome that administrative intricacy.
Any thoughts around that, Chris?
I mean, I've been working with startups and investors for quite a number of years. What I've noticed when I've come to Korea 3 years ago, and it still happens a lot, and I found that a lot of Korean startups, the founding teams, they're very passionate about the technology. So you will see a lot of founding teams, all the members are from the same university, or probably even from similar year, maybe even from the same year. And they're all very, very smart about the technology. They can go, on and on about the tech side. But when they try to work with international markets, the founding team, there's no people with expertise in IR, there's no people with expertise in compliance or even business development, et cetera, et cetera. So when they go into, say, an arena with other international startups, then they are at a disadvantage. So I would suggest that Korean startups to really think about expanding their founding team, or at least maybe not the founding team, but you need to incorporate those elements into your company before you really go overseas.
I think that's really smart there. And switching gears here more internally, going global, there's also the workforce piece, different cultures, managing teams. Any thoughts around how to navigate that for anybody who's looking to expand globally with potentially working with people on the ground within different countries?
Wow, we hire locally, and we've got 9 offices globally. I've lost count of how many nationalities we have in the team. It's probably like maybe 15 or 20 different nationalities, and that means 15 to 20 different cultures, right? And what you want to be able to do as a startup, as a unified company, is yes, you have a global unified culture, but you also have to be cognizant of your local cultures, right? So we try to be flexible as much as possible. And remote work really, I mean, if we are effectively globally remote, right? So it's an accepted part of our business.
I fully agree with Brian. And when I'm based here now, I moved here 3 years ago. When I came here, I have to be sensitive to the local culture, how the workplace culture works here, and I think the reverse has to be true for Korean startups. When they go overseas, they have to be mindful of how things work. You mentioned an anecdote earlier when we were backstage about the U.S. investors. Once they got the business cards in the meeting, they just placed it, or I won't say throw it, but they just placed it on the table. In Korea, of course, it's a little bit different. But it's little things like that, things like that don't be discouraged or don't find it threatening or disrespectful, because every culture is different. And just to add on to that, international investors or corporates that you meet with or you try to pitch to, they must get hundreds of decks a month or even a week. So it's a numbers game. If the first couple of investors you don't hear back from them, maybe find out from them what they didn't like about your pitch. I mean, don't be afraid to ask people why they didn't, decide to work with you, because maybe they didn't, but if they may share some advice with you that you can incorporate into your pitches later on, and that may work with other investors.
That's great advice there. Also, something that I think would be really helpful as well is expectations with sales cycles, expanding to different markets as well. As a startup, if I'm, like Brian mentioned, having limited resources, making sure I'm being effective with those resources, what should be my expectations with sales cycles, being able to project that out, especially when it's a new market that you have no data on? Any thoughts around that?
I think the sort of underlying theme of the previous question remains is that you have to be mindful of what the overseas market, the way the market, or if we talk about sales cycle or even sourcing cycle. For example, I know a technology company. They provide solutions for very glamorous events, fashion shows, for example. So, of course, Paris Fashion Week or Seoul Fashion Week, Milan Fashion Week. There's a lot of these events around September, October, and January. And he used to joke, or he still jokes about he hasn't had like a Chuseok holiday or a New Year, Christmas holiday for many years. But these are some of the things you have to be mindful of. If you get stuck into your practice or your habits in Korea, those timelines, those cycles may not work overseas. You must be mindful of that.
That's great. Brian, any thoughts around that?
I mean, we're very fortunate that we sell to consumers, but we do work with distributors. We're also very fortunate that our sales cycle is relatively short to the distributors because they actually come to us nowadays and ask us to take us on. But in the early days, like for example in Japan's a very conservative retail country. So if you still go to an electronics store or let's say a big camera or Yodobashi, the stores, like they will stuff the shelves with a lot of stuff all at once. And it took us 4 years to get them used to the idea of kids technology. So in the past, if you wanted to buy a kid's wearable smartphone, you'd have to go to mobile section. You want to buy a camera, you have to go to the camera section. But it took us only 4 years for them to set up a kids tech section, but we finally did it. So just prepare for the long haul.
That's great advice. Is there anything we have not touched on that either of you would like to talk more about, or any questions like that?
I think if one thing that's very important now, if you are in maybe not platforms, but if you are something a little bit deeper from the technology side, I think data diversity is very important. For example, if you're in biotech or anything to do with genomics, if your entire R&D is done in Korea, the most likely scenario is that all your research data, your clinical trials, everything is based on Korean DNA. If you try to bring that to an international market thinking that you can commercialize it straight away, that probably doesn't work. You need to include other regions, other countries' DNA information into your clinical trials. So you need to think about these things. You can't just expect that what works in Korea would work in another market straight away.
Awesome. So last question that I have. Both of you have either helped people who are on the global journey or have embarked on your own global journey. If you could go back in time before you went on that global journey and give your past self advice, what advice would you give to yourself?
Well, instead of going global, I would say just put all your money in Bitcoin and retire instead of flying budget, a lot of budget. Right? It's a tough journey, right? Jensen Huang, right, a founder of NVIDIA, right? I mean, he gave an interview not too long ago. I mean, the guy's worth $40 billion now, and he says don't do it because it's hard, right? So what about us, right? But it is hard. It is hard, but it is rewarding. Yeah.
Wise words. Chris?
Absolutely, and I want to add on to that, and it's also similar to what Brian mentioned earlier about the products as well. It's like, it's not a linear journey. You don't have a sort of expected growth for your startup. And as you all know, I'm sure, the percentage of startups that actually make it to the top is not a huge number. And, most likely you will, struggle for a number of years. You have to keep at it. Maybe one day that will happen, and that will happen exponentially. It's just somehow it will happen. But if you don't have the determination, if you don't have the perseverance, I would suggest that maybe don't waste your time, because if you don't pursue that to the end, then it could be very difficult to be successful at it, and maybe you can spend the time better at investing in Bitcoin or something else.
Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate your time, and the audience as well. If we can give a round of applause for our panelists. This was a great time. Thank you.